What if the silence beneath your feet is older than your story? You stand, perhaps at night, with dust in your shoes and stone under your hand, and you ask a single forbidden question. I will walk with you. I am a guide through records and layers, not an oracle. Listen to the stillness. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Stay. We will unfold slowly. If you would join this quiet work, subscribe as if making an offering. This is ceremonial, not casual. This is a slow unpeeling. In the prevailing story, there is a foundational assurance. The landscape's earliest substantial structures are assumed to be the work of settled communities, villages taking shape after the long drift of hunter-gatherers. This narrative, quietly reused and retold in field reports and textbooks, arranges time along convenient thresholds. Before, nomads wandered. After, houses gathered in clusters and permanence acquired the weight of stone. In this account, the origins of true architecture belong to habitation, to presence, to the giving of names and boundaries. It seems safe, almost comforting, until the ground itself resists. Layers are peeled away by careful hands. Soil is sifted, screens catching the smallest things, the historical residue of occupation. Amid the thickness of silence and dust, beneath the clay-packed floors and the charred flecks of domestic past, there are stones deliberate, dressed, arranged. Beneath the earliest recognizable traces of life lived fragments of pottery, seeds blackened by time, bone mute, and unrecognizable. There are constructional remains that do not belong to these households. Deep in the stratified accumulation, before the comfort of the familiar, there sit courses of shaped blocks. They are not random. The edges hold the memory of tool, the faces brush with regularity. Movements once encoded in muscle and habit are stilled, but their residue persists. Measurement, width of cut socket, depth of mortise, the angle of incidence between jointed stones. These are not ordinary rocks gathered in expedience, nor does improvisation explain their articulation. Some sockets are carved into the resolute bedrock, sharp in their boundaries. Mortises shaped hollows have been filled and sealed. Above, habitation layers stutter and shift, already dissolving into the anonymity of soil. Below, these assemblies wait, resisting narrative as much as erosion. Stone on stone, fitted closely, fitted with intention. The surfaces bear regular marks, not of accident, not of weather, but of repeated, patient work. The kind that assumes both time and technique. Some of this is only seen in a harsh, raking light at the end of day, when the spoil heaps settle and the wind dies. Patterns appear and vanish as the angle changes. It is the kind of evidence that asks to be witnessed in silence. Records accumulate, each observation tightening the description and returning the reader to the same puzzle. Diagrams are drawn, X's marking the joins, dashes delineating extended courses, photographs catch the alignment, the shadowed depths between each stone, the palimpsest of working. There are ledger entries, stone, measurements, context, cross-reference. The work does not resolve, only circles. Radiocarbon samples are taken, trial after trial, the organic matter dust caught in cracks. Whisper-thin deposits sealing a joint returns its date. Earlier still, before any domestic debris. The pottery is above, within the upper layers, its fragments gathered and catalogued, a record of use and discard. The stones are underneath. They do not participate in the same chronology. They are prior. There is no story supplied in the stratigraphy, only the pause of absence, the echo of what is lost. Above, the evidence of household charcoal, potsherd, seed husk, a worked bone. Below, the architecture of intention without any context but its own existence. The tension is quiet, understated, but constant. An inherited architecture sits beneath an emergent household. What is built atop is lighter, more fragile, made for a season or two, perhaps meant to be abandoned and renewed. What lies below has endured abandonment itself, has become the ground for all settlements after, has absorbed the quiet accumulation of years and names and erasures. The ledgers simply repeat the facts, measurements, images, sketches, sample codes. The joiners of stone and the cleaners of hearth are joined only by the accident of sequence, not by certainty. The stones, once observed, resist being made part of a story. Their mass is mute. Tool marks crowd the surfaces, but say nothing about the hands that made them. Even the act of cataloguing feels incomplete. The stones are described, numbered, but not comprehended. The diagrams always circle back: socket, mortise, joint, alignment without direction. They are enveloped by the soil, then by the gaze of observers, and finally by the ledgers and the archives. The act of uncovering becomes a paradox. To remove is to reveal, but also to recognize how little is truly known. The strata communicate only by layers of absence, the before and the after made plain only through what fails to be explained. Dust settles anew, sealing in the uncertainty. The stones persist beneath every attempt to name and order them, refusing to collapse into any easy thread of interpretation. The record is complete, and yet silent. This silence constitutes its own kind of memory, its own inviolable boundary. The act of measurement, intended to bring clarity, only deepens the separation. The foundations return, always, to voicelessness. There remains a prevailing conviction, often repeated in lectures, essays, and quiet conversations beside dig sites. Celestial observation, and the dense material record it leaves, are late arrivals. Stars, it is said, only captured the gaze of those already tethered to the earth, those who had arranged themselves into the patient permanence of agricultural settlements. Such is the orderliness of the story told. People cease moving, construct homes and walls, and, in the lull that follows, they measure the sky. The earth provides their anchor, and only then, the story concludes, do they carve stone to track what passes overhead. There is comfort in this sequence: stillness, observation, inscription, the night sky marked only after the ground is made to yield. Yet there are stones. They stand on bare rises, silent above empty plains, often far from the refuse of hearth or post hole. To approach is always to recognize something unaligned with expectation. The orientation of these megaliths is neither haphazard nor dictated by surrounding topography. Field notebooks, weathered by wind and handling, contain the logged measurements, azimuths, inclinations, recorded with care, line after line, inscribed in thin pencil. Night after night, unseen hands once moved along these lines, their calculations preserved in angles, the data now as mute as the stones themselves. In tabular form, each number is precise, each value cross-checked. The standard methods obeyed. The alignment is not accidental. The stars mapped for these orientations, when calculated backward, fall not on the skies witnessed by those who built nearby dwellings, but earlier, centuries, sometimes millennia, earlier. Calibrated software offers dates. The discrepancy widens. Material detail accumulates. Surfaces of the stones, especially their narrower faces, bear marks, tiny hollows, pitted in sequence, sometimes joined by smooth tracks where fine dust gathers, shielded from rain. The touch is deliberate, not weather-etched. Tools left no signature, only careful evidence of an intention, one aligning sight, perhaps to the horizon, perhaps raised toward a star's seasonal climb. The silence of technique endures. Not far, there are petroglyphs, shallow, geometric, angular. They are clustered, always on the flanks adjacent to what one recognizes as the stone's line of sight. Again, the pattern is evident. Repetition of motif. A motif, reducible to angle, inclination, an echo of what exists in the logs. No figures, no stories, just lines and crossings. Some so faint that only late daylight reveals them. Repetition, always. Ground passes beneath these marks, sometimes stripped by wind, sometimes covered by lichen and moss. The technicality of the record resists embellishment. Written notes, columns of digits, terse to the point of silence. No invocation, no statement of purpose, No veneer of ritual language, measurements without context, stones without clear authors. The disruption grows with each observation. Field seasons pass, and the technical manner of recording does not correspond with a known tradition. One might look for traces of later inhabitants, signs that the settlement built around the stones, that memory grew from occupation. Yet the record refuses to clarify. The stones precede the settlement's footprint in alignment, but not always in substance. The hands that carved, placed, and pecked do not name themselves, nor do they recount what compelled guiding lines to converge on a vanished event in the sky. The stones stand, and any watching presence now, or then, remains implied, half present in the residue of friction and intention. For the observer, the passage through each site gathers weight, forms a slow, cyclical recognition. Day fades, shadow stretches across the worn fields, and the line of sight is felt rather than known. Time, when indexed on stone, separates itself from habitation, from vessel, from tool. The remains are not ritual drama. They are instrument and record, sharper than myth, but buried beneath sediment and silence. Repeatedly, the same question circles back, unsigned in the soil. These markers for the sky, do they belong to the same hands as those who measured and ate near their base, or do they pass through time as inheritance, function divorced from its origin, meaning borrowed, remade? The layers offer no reply. Excavation reveals only thresholds. Above, below, before, after. The instrument of sky measurement preserves nothing of itself but utility. Each settle of dust, each season, each patina offers further muteness. Observers become record keepers, witnesses, and the evidence cycles again into ambiguity. Earthbound, horizon-locked, eternity in the angle of their faces. The absence of explanation is its own kind of sediment, something compacted and enduring. The settlement recedes, memory unspools. The celestial alignments persist above, gone from memory but inscribed in rock, outlasting every intended meaning. What calendar did they inherit? There is always an initial frame, a clarity, or the promise of one, given in the quiet language of stone beneath earth. The assumption stands steady as a lintel, worn smooth by repetition. Subterranean chambers must be tombs. The logic arrives clothed in consensus. Once, there was a community above, and below they interred their dead, in careful intent, sealed and honoured. As generations pass, the surface shifts, but the belief deepens. Sediment hardened into certainty. Rooms below the soil are evidence of memory, of mourning, of ritual closure. This is what is said, and so much descends from that single point of faith. Yet the record resists. A vault is found, one among several, folded silently beneath floors newer than its own stone. Not immediate, not obvious. The room is closed, not collapsed, not fallen into neglect, but sealed. The evidence persists in methodical obstacles. Horizon layers of hard-packed clay, each one marking an interval between above and beneath. Even as the village reshapes itself, with each currency of habitation, the vault below remains untouched. Secret, unspeaking. It is not a room open for grief. Not a crypt lined with the objects of funerary passage. Instead, the fill is sterile, unbroken by trace of ash, fragment of bone, gesture of farewell. No assemblage identifies itself as witness. No grave goods name the builder, nor the built for, nor the act itself. The register's patient, objective record lintels still in their place, entire and unsplintered. Doors that once yielded, now locked in their final gesture. Humidity low, dry, almost surgical in abstention, preserving what is absent as carefully as what remains. Layers of sediment crowd the space, finer than dust, relegating time to a mute accumulation. One measures the floor, the arc of a wall, the quiet sweep of a roof, each profile indifferent to the codes of mortuary typology. The proportions echo no familiar crypt or chamber designed for the dead of the culture rebuilt above. The chamber is not echoed by what comes after. It is overlain not by memory, but merely by time passing, undisturbed. Prized loose with practiced reverence, labelled, the evidence slips through the calibrations, unsettling order. Dates are coaxed out in laboratories distant from the hush of soil. Always older, older than any hearth above, older than any domestic discard, older than the first sweep of refuse or ash that marks a dwelling's certainty. This older stratum, this compressed matrix at the vault's threshold, insists on its own logic. It does not communicate its purpose, only its sequence. It waits, acknowledged by chemistry and registration, but never yielding intention. Profiles drawn in graphite, cross-sections rendered in, slow and faithful. The catalogues multiply not with riches, but with the silence of formlessness. No carved reliefs, no sealed jars, no vestiges of spirit pathways, only the room, empty, before the first hearth ever flickered above it. Only a vault, closed by an act whose memory is as sealed as the space. It is the moment before certainty that unspools and repeats. The evidence is catalogued. The records expand, each entry braced not by conclusion, but by recurrence. The air hangs heavy between each note taken, as if testing the boundaries of patience. Low humidity, sterile infill, an unbroken lintel. Every detail refracts through the same lens. If there is a question, it is spoken without voice, implied along the brooding boundaries of light and forgotten labour. On the plans, the underlay forms a blank, girded by dates, resisting integration. The contrast resolves into a kind of duality, a built below and occupied above, each separate, each inscrutable to the other. Yet the evidence keeps its own vigil, patient, immune to the earnestness of interpretation. The vault is closed, the fill is mute, the floor horizons layering their argument. Even memory grows tentative. In the sterile dust, beneath the weight of the unbroken ceiling, a hush is all that marks the difference between one time and another. And now, with the room open only in the record, not in the world, you stand at the threshold, a witness to the gap rather than the answer. The register is more complete, the silence more articulate. Each measurement, each catalogue distinction, accumulates on the ledger of the unknown. The absence outlasts clarity. The hush in the vault draws out, suspended and slow, and the patient air asks the only question it ever could. Who first closed those doors? To begin, you are given a shape of belief. The stone, heavy and unyielding, did not move by miracle or convulsion. Instead, it shifted by local hands, by the patient, measured efforts that accrue as villages, become denser, as needs coalesce, as burdens are shouldered together. The narrative lingers here, in this clean arc of assumption stone migrated outward, inch by inch, as life gathered near. Each outcrop, each exposed ledge, gave itself slowly to the spread of habitation, its bulk diminished by the slow pressure of community striving and proximity. This notion rests easily, like the memory of wear on an old path. First settlement, then stone, then structure rising from dirt and loss. But evidence does not fold itself so neatly. The documentary line bends, falters, insists. Survey notes, years of them at the margins, repeat a different kind of order, one not shaped by the obvious crescendos of population. In the thin marks penned along field notebooks, in the fine cross-hatching of archived aerial imagery, there is a geometry that lies beneath the comfortable surface. Grooves unpardonably straight, undeniably measured, radiate from the core of primary bedrock. Their direction is not random, not the play of water or wind, but purpose inscribed in abrasion. These grooves lead out farther than questions, farther than any present shadow of a village, touching points where old hands set stone upon stone in patterns that can still, in fragments, be touched. Surfaces along these lines concede the repeated theft of passage, compacted where foot, drag, or rudimentary sled may have pressed the earth into submission. Some stretches are hollowed, some are lined in shallow furrows that echo in satellite composites and in the thin, white light of survey dawns. The consistency parallel hollows, preserving the stubborn memory of many burdens, discounts accident. It is a sediment of motion, pressure captured and made nearly permanent by repetition, in a single direction, always away from the quarry mouths, always toward the places where walls would eventually stand. There are absences, too, that make themselves loud. There is no persistent cluster, no light scatter of artifacts, no reliable pattern of habitations along these tracks. In the long, unoccupied stretches, there is only the record of momentum. No warming scatter of potsherds, no hearths gone cold, no objects dropped and reclaimed by earth. The geography is not domestic. It is measured, calculated, stripped of the refuge of ordinary presence. Each line is testament to a function that precedes fellowship, that moves ahead of density or comfort. At the quarries themselves, shadows deepening in the cut stone, mornings lengthened by high, exposed faces, there are the marks of labour itself, catalogued again and again. The gouges are deep, their spacing monotonously regular. They are not proof of improvisation or panic, but of process, sometimes traced by fingertip through accumulations of dust in the low sun. Against the harsh bedrock, each impression is a ledger, each interval a rhythm unbroken by haste. Calculations, scrawled in graphite, record the course lengths, the estimation of burden against distance, sound echoing off stone to those who linger long enough to listen. Maps, compiled and compared, render these tracks explicit. Photographs, sepia and satellite alike, preserve their lines in negative space, running out from exposed quarries to the far tentacles of absent foundations. In these renderings, the friction becomes almost visible, a fossil of intent laid down in recession after recession of footsteps or groaning cartwheels. Direction and resistance fossilized together, two facts that intersect in dust and time. The eye is drawn along them, villages fading into conjecture, only to be left with the stubborn trace of what moved and how, if not who or why. The assumption of order from density is unsettled underfoot. Movement, and not the crowding of life, defines these paths. The tracks come first, then the horizon, then perhaps the echoes of building. If echoes are heard at all, the tension resides quietly. Extraction and motion, organized and persistent, predates the warmth of clustering settlements. Silences cluster alongside the lines, pockets where only the evidence persists, not the stories or the faces that once gave rise to them. The record remains, surveyor's ink, aerial void, mapped interruption. These tracks are repositories not of explanation, but of friction. Their purpose is not to be confessed, only to be read in contact, in angle, in absence. The surfaces remain compacted, the marks remain deep, the grooves remain straight, the corridors remain uninhabited. No voice interrupts the evidence. No afterimage furnishes certainty. It is memory rendered as pressure, direction fossilized in dirt. There is an assumption, easy to breathe in alongside dust and memory, that standardized units emerge when administration gathers and centralizes, forming a nucleus against the fragments of local craft. That before such centers, before record-keeping and decree, measurement is a scattered impulse, each maker carving out their world with a private sense of span and reach. Under this assumption, uniformity is a late visitor. In the cooled silence of a storehouse, among layers of silt and shadow, evidence waits neither proclamatory nor accidental. Dimensional modules repeat themselves, carved in stone, persisting at separate sites, now barely recognizable as belonging to any system at all. The same integer module, uncomfortably precise, recurs along their dressed faces, the marks echoing each other past thresholds of chance. Each repetition is not bold, but careful, nearly hesitant, insistently within tolerances that resist any easy dismissal. You stand before the evidence, it neither asserts nor denies, but it endures. You read survey sheets, the paper growing brittle, hands cautious to avoid the splintering edge. The intervals recorded there map out measure's rhythm. Repeated spans, etched lines, broken off but clear, each interval mapped in relation to a surviving measuring rod, a fragment. That rod carries no declaration of purpose, only abrasions and proportionality scored through age. Calibrations are checked and rechecked, not only by present eyes, but by those before you, the archival voice persistent in its enumeration, retaining distance from interpretation. Within the metrological analysis, the ratios repeat. Proportions hold, sometimes perfectly, more often only just within error. Baselines stretch along the length of eroded plinths. Column bases stand apart by calculated space. Stone blocks echo common figures. Each is rendered coolly on the record, reduced to digits, diagram, code. To witness the marks still visible, though some have all but dissipated under centuries of dust. It is not a matter of calculation alone. The marks themselves resist easy summarization. Some are faint, their grooves worn shallow under the slow attrition of time, others still more assertive, catching traces of light at certain angles, hiding themselves when the day fades. None announce their origin. The stones, coded and logged, fill shelves and drawers, tags affixed, locations mapped, the surfaces half remembered by fingertip and photograph. These units in stone predating the steep berms and crowded outlines of the settlements that now rise in ruin nearby. These faint modules outlast the living voices that might have set the measure, transmitting not intention but only repetition. The largest habitats, the once celebrated centers, are still centuries away when these stones are shaped, their intervals marked, their alignments preserved more by fortune than by plan. You listen for a proclamation in the archive but find none. The numbers remain numbers. The etchings are only grooves and indentations, passed for pattern, never for intention. There is a dryness, a deliberate withholding in these records. The observer, hundreds of years ago or yesterday, catalogues but does not announce. Hands record, not to declare but to leave open the possibility of understanding, which never quite arrives. Is there a threshold here? You wonder, not allowed to declare, but allowed to notice. The tension persists, projected into the gap between ad hoc craft and systems passed down. Neither fully sovereign, every repeated module is both inheritance and improvisation. Every stone oscillates between being an isolated object worked by a practiced hand and a participant in a sequence inherited, maintained, never explained. Measurement, made quiet by distance, becomes something less than a system, more than an accident. The repetition is mundane, sometimes almost invisible, a layering of similarity that beckons only when compiled and compared, when patience allows the pattern to surface out of apparent incongruity. Each mark, each span, is an echo, a refrain with no lyric, only a number. As the dust settles, the marks fade still further. Under brush and cloth, their clarity falters, but recording persists. To log, to catalogue, to store, this is what remains possible. The codes grow longer, the entries more meticulous, all hinting at a system not fully discerned. The storehouse darkens each year. The audience for these stones contracts with every academic cycle. Memory is partial, an archive of pauses and omissions. The silence in the records, the lack of intention claimed, becomes a palpable presence as you read and reread, page and stone, code and surface, number and shadow. The tension does not yield. It accumulates a weighted quiet. So you return to the evidence, again and again, refreshing your sense of presence among these intervals, these ratios, these mute echoes. The stones do not answer. Dust accumulates. Marks retreat into the slow disappearance of meaning. The only motion is in the careful act of noticing, of recording what endures, what aligns, what refuses dissolution, and always, beneath the accumulation of numbers and the patient repetition of intervals, it is often assumed a quiet, persistent certainty that isotopic traces within ancient human remains offer a smooth record of subsistence. A gentle transition, as agriculture rose, written in the bones themselves, The familiar story settles like dust across the shelves of records. As cultivation spread, hunger and foraging gave way to sowing and reaping, and the isotopic signatures, those spectral fingerprints in nitrogen and carbon, changed slowly, predictably, inevitably. In this story, the bones never resist. Their data align, a whisper of order drifting downward through time, grain by grain. Life shaped by the field, not the field by life. This is the assumption. Familiar, reassuring for those who catalogue, who process, who number each fragment and place it back into the quiet rows of archival drawers, its meaning, supposedly, already inscribed. Evidence does not always cooperate, and the narrative finds itself shifted. The shift is not loud, not dramatic, but it remains. It reveals itself in the archives, in the laboratory ledgers, in silent tables of numbers that do not align, in the residue of what was stored and what was consumed. But not with voices. Early skeletons unearthed beside ancient communal storage pits register abrupt isotopic shifts that do not match the slow drift of expected agricultural transition. The laboratory isolates samples, measures the fine balances between ratios of nitrogen and carbon records, recalculates, compares. The numbers are returned, checked, filed. They do not correspond to the slow arc of foraging to farming. Instead, there is something sudden, edged, a signature almost out of place, unexplained, hovering at thresholds before and after, then and now. Storage features, massive and meticulously cored, preserve botanical remains sealed beneath layers of sediment. Samples are drawn, sieved, weighed, and labelled, grain by grain, seed by seed, each measure entered into inventories as old as any narrative. The botanical remains hold their own isotopic traces, suggesting neither the wild varieties found just beyond the settlement, nor the cultivated types that will later fill the archaeobotanical record. Their values do not align with the steady, local routine suggested by landscape and climate. Instead, they exist somewhere between neither fully known nor fully foreign, silent in the face of expectation. No lists of rations, no ledgers of provision, no narrative of intentional food allocation written for those who would later measure and calculate. The bones are catalogued, each labelled, each placed into quiet boxes, each entry a name, a date, a measurement. The storage contexts are mapped, sampled, and cored, each feature reduced to a skein of numbers, measurements, ratios, and locations. The bones return to darkness, to shelves lined in institutional calm. Nothing in the evidence insists. The numbers are simply entered, the grains are weighed, the layers charted, and yet the records prove resistant to the old narrative of emergence. They suggest, as if in passing, that dependency may have roots beyond opportunity, that resource management once moved quietly through these walls, persistent, unsung, perhaps inherited as a silent ledger rather than the product of innovation alone. The absence of posture is itself a posture. There is no account, no voice, no explanation. In this silence, tension settles. What if the provision, the storage, the consumption did not speak for itself, but was a condition to be inherited, implied, never stated, perhaps never even noticed by those who lived within it? What do these abrupt shifts conceal? Not quite permitted to become knowledge. The evidence loops bones measured, samples stored, reports archived, uncertainties passed quietly down each cycle, refusing resolution. There is only the question repeated in different forms. Who recorded? Who witnessed? Who provided? The bones are returned. The stores are resealed against the silence of the present. What remains is not meaning, but a pause, a gap, an unsettled space between what is known and what can be named. You stand among shelves, names and codes ordered and tidy, but meaning wavering. You consider the heavy storage features, the abrupt isotopic edges, the grains that register as neither wild nor cultivated, the persistent silence of documentation, the pulse disturbance at the threshold of interpretation. Fragments refuse alignment, persistent as a shadow in the evening. Data cluster, but refuse the final step into narrative clarity. Night returns, as it always does, settling over the evidence, holding the room in a shallow trance. The bones are quiet, again, and the story remains just out of reach. The final records are shelved, all doors closed. One question lingers alone, unspoken, never entered into any archive. Who first stored that harvest? It begins as most origins are said to begin, with an assumption quietly accepted among the shelves and dust of collected fragments. Writing begins here, it is said, within the contexts to which the surviving clay tablets are attributed. This is the chronicle, the consensus, quietly replicated in the margins of catalogues and the careful prose of monographs. These pieces were inscribed, then, in one moment, each tablet a declaration, an intention captured in the impression of a reed stylus, the trace of order, calculation, petition, record. The beginning is fixed, and it is here. But the surface yields more than first expected. In the artificial dusk of the conservation lab, under a raking light, new marks come forward, an undertow of erased incisions, nearly erased, existing beneath the layer of script that faces the observer now. The later writing legible, already translated, already classified, sits atop shadows. The tablet becomes less the bearer of a singular act, and more a silent sediment, a surface that keeps record by holding what has been lost. Laboratory logs attend to this quietly, noting the presence of these incisions, faint against the sherd's surface. On some, the script beneath is so weak that it is barely present lines, only visible when the angle of the lamp is exact. In the darkroom, under the smooth eye of infrared imaging, more emerges, layered impressions, under text, erased but not banished. They speak of layered marks, the surface reworked, edges uncertain where old characters have been abraded into a semblance of smoothness. The clay holds the indentation of what came before, but only just. The undertext forms a structure within the body of the newer inscription, positions that do not quite correspond, glyphs and signs with no clear analogue in the corpus that has been preserved and extensively published. A palimpsest, a written over slate, but with the material memory of what was first intended. It is at once a record and a burial. The evidence is precise, but offers little in the way of narrative. Samples are taken. The measurements yield a sequence numbers scripted in the margins of laboratory books. The result is a split. The event that hardened the underlying clay predates, by an interval unspoken, the event of writing that is now visible. The overlaying inscription is newer, the erased one older, measured not in centuries but perhaps in the slow persistence of the kiln. The tablet is thus both earlier and later, carrying forward a moment twice made. It is evidence without a storyteller. The tension sharpens. Is the object inherited, carrying forward its own fading record, or is it reused, wiped clean, but never entirely erased? In the administrative silence of the archive, the tablets are handed down again, this time to trays, labelled, their undersides often out of view but always documented. Photographs, taken systematically, record even the fragments of reworking, a catalogue of erasure and presence. The surfaces, flat, undramatic, become sites of layered memory. The inventory is made complete not only by counting what is there, but by registering the ghost of what is gone. The observers here are record keepers, witnesses to what persists, but also to what withdraws. The photographs are silent. The catalogues do not speculate. There is no living tradition to speak the reasons. Reuse or inheritance, utility or reverence. These postures of the past remain closed to interpretation. There are no stories, only material reminders. The palimpsests persist without explanation, records of both action and concealment. In the quiet of the storage, each tablet gathers dust as a sedimentary text. What is present presses down on what is erased, but does not silence it. The clay remembers even as it is smoothed and covered. Inheritance is itself a kind of erasure, as is reuse a tension unresolved, an ambiguity held in the substance itself. Across the span of centuries, the clay offers no answer. Surface and undersurface, inscription and erasure, drift apart but never separate fully. What remains is evidence, traces, and layers, marks of use, faint shadows seeking witness. The pale marks beneath the bold script, the recalibrated dates, the reluctant imagery, all sit together in one silent ensemble. No certainty emerges, only a question formed in the dim residue of writing and rewriting. What was written and then rubbed away? It is sometimes said, quietly and with an air of certainty, that metallurgy advances in order. First the simple, then the complex. The metallurgical sequence, as it has been quietly traced through soil and expectation, supposes that high-temperature processes and intricate alloys emerge only after a long familiarity with softer fires, simpler ores, purer iron and copper, drawn from patient, low-burning kilns. It is an order that comforts. Complexity, in this vision, is always a later visitor. Layer upon layer of earth write this narrative, and it is taken, for a time, as a natural law. There are places dust-congested dig sites, catalogued by methodical hands where the evidence sits without consent to these patterns. This evidence waits, mute but unsettled, among the long shadows of storerooms and the chalked lines of section drawings. Assumption faces the peculiar grit of material record, a friction not easily smoothed away. From the earliest strata, where only the most modest implements are expected, there arise other witnesses. Slag, darkly lustrous and irregular, emerges beneath the surface, unearthed as so much anticipated waste, yet its story is unfamiliar. Associated with it are residues from bloomery processes, heavy with memory. Report pages capture its surface, a mosaic of phases in perplexing heterogeneity, metallic and glassy, spattered with inclusions. Laboratory cases receive these fragments, and under spectral light, the compositions unfold. Trace alloying elements register in the spectrum chromes and nicks, not easily dismissed. The signature requires something more than a careless fire. Controlled temperatures, repeated smelting, a choreography practiced and precise. The matrix, cooled in long-lost storage trays, is fractured and dull, but in the lab its organization betrays a mind to heat and time. Section drawings, held under careful lamplight by the observer, reveal the kiln structures that once glowed. Their contexts are catalogued, stratigraphically mapped and oriented. There is a rhythm to this work, layer, classified over layer, each structure set in place. The kilns and their residues sit below the more recognizable forms. Simple tools, expected and inventory safe. Its chemical complexity, measured in careful columns and percentages, outpaces the forms that might have justified such practices. It sits there, buried already intricate, before simplicity was fashioned as a habit. There is no industry, no intermediate progression, no archaeological trace whose practicality might explain such a leap. In the surrounding layers, no slow improvement, no half-made attempts, no tentative trial towards alloy emerges. The inventories move from simple to complex in one unquestioned leap, an absence in the middle, a silence that weighs more than the objects themselves. The air of the archive is thick with this lack. Pages turn to verify what is not there. Observers, record keepers, silent witnesses in the half-lit confines of temporary offices and long-stacked shelves move over the stratigraphy again. The evidence is handled, remeasured, doubted, and again affirmed. Each blackened crust, each metallic shard, is logged, labelled, cross-referenced, weighed for the memory it carries. There is an absence of certainty, a hollow in the record where a gradient ought to be. It is sometimes easier to write what is not present instead. The tools that would prepare for this metallurgical intricacy, the transitional kilns, the progression from ignorance to expertise, the archive remains stubbornly mute on these points. Attention lingers, quiet but unresolved. The timeline strains beneath its contradictory layers. The crystallized waste, the unaccountable bloom, the sequence that will not arrange itself. Technological explanation falters. Does technique arrive unheralded? An event rather than a process? Or does it represent something prior, a knowledge unrecorded, lost behind the shadow of burned roofs and crushed earth, erased before circumstance could inscribe it. Hands that sort and classify, that document and re-examine, are left to pause across the cold trays where the slag cools. The textures on the surface have been described in thin, looping scrawl, then digitized, then held again to scrutiny. Each sample is both question and refusal, an artifact of silence as much as of method. Time has passed, and with it, understanding wavers. The laboratory is still. Only the instruments hum. Only the spectral graphs throw their pale glow onto evidence that cannot speak. In the fading memory of the site, as dust drifts against the stone and light moves quietly across the earth cut, a sense of loss accumulates, indistinguishable from time itself. It settles inside the catalogue, inside the structure of every unanswered layer. What precedes, what follows, what is left unexplained, these remain the true contents of the record. Sometimes, in the very last lines of each report, the question waits, held in suspension. Whose furnaces ran first? There is a comfort in what has been assumed. One rests in the gentle persistence of scholarly inheritance stone. They say, cannot be melted by the hand of ordinary people. Vitrification, it is thought, belongs elsewhere, a rare act, post-dating the main body of the lived ruin. Flames of sufficient heat are not for the fire of the home, nor for the slow, domestic gestures that mark the ordinary history of a site. If vitrified stone appears, it is a later flourish, a singular event appended to the margins of chronology. In the careful quiet where one guards these assumptions, each layer of dust promises reliability, sequence, sense. Yet there, beneath the patient cold of the archive, something endures that loosens these binds. The evidence is exact, almost unremarkable by itself, a slide, a label, a measured fraction of rock so translucent against the light it offers its secrets only in fragments. Thin sections laid on glass, scrutinized under lenses that never tire. The slides reveal more than the eye expects. Localized bands, dark and shining, grip the fractured heart of otherwise ancient stonework. This crust, fluid in texture, clings to the surfaces of foundations. The spatial regularity is a gentle persistence not everywhere, not chaotic, but intentional, or at least systematic. Adjacent stones unmarked. Then, abrupt transitions where the vitrified skin thickens. These are not wounds, but deliberate margins, as if marked by some precise but inscrutable logic. Reports collect in the field, books, mineral assemblages, changed beyond what can be achieved in the daily pyres of habitation. Feldspars rendered amorphous, quartz grains smoothed to undulant glass, opaque minerals crowded at boundaries, thermally altered far above what the evidence of broken hearths and charred bone might allow. There are no spent furnaces, no abandoned mounds of slag, no clustering of pyrotechnic debris to illuminate the process, no beds of ash thickened by relentless firing, no hill of spent charcoal, no room blackened by centuries of unrelenting heat. Only the transformed skin, catching light at the angle of the lens, refusing to betray its source. The process by which these faces were made is absent from the residue of ordinary life. The patchwork of vitrification respects alignment, edges and faces, walls that once shaped thresholds or defined the periphery of a lived space. Where one might expect irregularity, there is instead restraint. Each band is mapped, thickness recorded, associated with order amid ruin. It is the silence that measures difference. Why here and not there? Why a circumference thickened? Why a centroid spared? In a dozen foundations, the same notation recurs. Crust, thickness, luster, edge. The glass is neither wild nor arbitrary. Its presence is a faint echo of something practiced, intentional, or merely remembered in stone. Associated with context, but never with certainty. Geological notation repeats. Vitrified layer present. High temperature alteration. No domestic pyrotechnic source observed. The documents accumulate, not as revelations but as murmurs. They call out for explanation through their meticulous silence. Observers stand distant, complicit in the act of noting, but not of knowing. The transformation persists in the record mineral phases that cannot be reversed, a glassy memory imprinted on stone. Positions fixed along orthogonal axes, spatial congruence noted, orientation mapped. Photographs pick out sheen where weathered surface breaks to reveal an inner, lucid border. The observer's gloves dust off grains that do not detach, the crust clinging, unyielding, as if to withhold even touch. Adjacent stones remain immune, neither blackened nor crazed. The ordinary fire leaves its mark. The vitrified face denies it. Where, in the cycle of occupation and abandonment, does this glass belong? Among ashes, there are only fragments. Among stone, the memory of heat, brittle and encased. There is a double absence, no artifactual hearth to explain the temperature, no pyre to justify the transformation, but also no chaos in the distribution. It is as if a rule was once known, then quietly revoked. The only persistent voice is that of the stone itself, fused, unyielding, maintaining in its altered form an archive more enduring than ink or paper. The question lingers in the glass, becomes the silence between notations, the darkness behind the observation lens, the cool hush of the storage room, where slides rest undisturbed while seasons move beyond the shuttered window. It is assumed, almost ritualistically, that water first followed the plough, that irrigation channels emerge as corollaries of cultivated land, trailing the geometry of early fields, shaping themselves to the needs of a people who had learned to sow and to reap. This rhythm agriculture rising, followed obediently by the slow incision of canals into earth and stone, remains embedded in prevailing accounts. Rarely troubled, rarely questioned. Roads may precede cities, but water, it is thought, arrives when the fields demand it. The pattern is familiar, repeated, taken up in arguments and teaching, quietly persistent in its logic. Underlying it all, the expectation that when you find a channel, a field will wait nearby, or soon after, or just before, yet the earth itself offers its own records. The geomatic surveys, persistent in their silence, trace old channels long after those who shaped them are gone. What emerges from these survey lines is not simplicity. Instead, there are channels not shallow, but cut through bedrock, following forgotten topographies, bending with the memory of vanished hills and invisible valleys. Each cross-section in the archive, each rendered elevation, lists deliberate inclines, deliberate transitions, intentional connections. Masonry appears where the stone softens, or where the water may have sought to slip away. Stone blocks, shaped, set in place with care, appear in the most vulnerable reaches. They do not match the fields mapped in any record from the earliest described cultivation here. Instead, they descend, often unexpectedly, beneath later layers, their walls smoothed by both intention and use, but sealed by events they cannot account for. The silt tells its own story. It fills the channels in open beds, layered with inflections of minerals. Above these fills, layers settle, occupation layers marked by refuse, stones fallen from elsewhere, artifacts overlooked, none belonging to the channels themselves. In the archive, sediment cores show the break, a boundary where sedimentation halts, abrupt and irrefutable, linked only to the abandonment of the channels, not their use. The discontinuity stands as a barrier. Water once moved, paused, then never returned, and the silence of that interruption stretches across centuries. Record keepers worked in sequence. The channels are plotted, measured, photographed. Light thrown across rough stone reveals shallow grooves bored into the channel floor, side walls that slip into shadow, outlines of masonry still regular in their decay. Photography isolates the lineaments, the gradient pivoting invisibly, the alignment with ancient topography, the silt capping the bottom, clean and final. The maps, drafted one atop the other, find the older channels straying beneath the roots of walls, fields, occupation mounds. Cross-sections and models establish proportions, depth versus width, gradient against distance, all patient, all guided by the evidence on hand. But the documents are more careful in what they do not show. There are no sluice gates, no spillways or weirs in the contemporaneous occupation debris, no maintenance pits, no shovels broken and left in haste, no layers of hastily excavated silt. In maintenance, there is absence, documented but unspoken. The infrastructure remained, inherited in stone, but its guardianship, if it ever existed, did not imprint itself onto the stratigraphy of new arrivals. So, the pattern fails its usual logic. Evidence accumulates, but instead of confirming, it unravels. They arrive before, cut not for fields that do not yet exist, but for a use now lost to silence. Abandoned, filled, capped by centuries, they reappear only as intrusions beneath the more perceived layers of agricultural occupation. Their memory is dry, locked in the bedrock, revealed by the fracture of time. The implied tension is not between land and water, but between use and inheritance. The infrastructure persists, even when its first purpose dissolves, mute within the geologic layers it divides. The observer returns to the record, finding only more cycles of silence. The present records merely echo the touch of ancient chisels and the weight of water no longer flowing. There is a sense of inheritance with no remembered bequest. The lines drawn on maps and the neatly transcribed tables of gradients are entries in a ledger of forgetting. Each visit to the channels adds little to the resolution, only more certainty that the answers remain withheld, staged not in the presence of knowledge, but its careful preservation. The question is not stated but always present. The frame between use and origin, agriculture and infrastructure, demand and silent preparation. Who, then, first opened those channels? It is easy, almost natural, to accept the smooth translation of years into numbers. The march of radiocarbon values, rendering time as a continuous unfolding. A sequence, one event at a time, one occupation changing quietly into the next, the detritus of each generation finding its place along that measured axis. Sample processed, result returned. The number awarded by the lab becomes a point on the curve, and in the mind's eye, an invisible arrow of history stretches out. There is comfort in this, perhaps a presumption that the evidence, observed and recorded with patient care, will politely affirm the order promised by line and calibration. That human activity is marked out in radiocarbon as it was lived incremental, date following date, the passage of time unfurling neatly beneath our gaze. But in the written logs, under lamplight, or encased within plastic sleeves brittle with age, the narrative falters. Clustered plateaus assert themselves, indifferent to tidy linearity. These plateaus, visible as broad shelves on graphs and in ledger columns alike, do not confine themselves to a single place or period. You find them echoed reiterated between sites, separated by miles, hills, rivers, and in the stratigraphic gaps assigned to different cultural phases. The offset, the shape of the stalls, each displays a sameness, a resonance that is out of keeping with the local context. Remnants of hearths at one site, the fills beneath wall foundations at another, an organic seal pressed long ago between stone and plaster, all find themselves marked by the same stilled refrain. The values grouped together, held fast for a span, resistant to the expected slope. Flatness where there should be gradient, an interval that repeats. Calibration notes, each one reflecting the hope that this time the correction will restore the march, nudge the plateau into its proper slope. Pre-treatment records the acid bath, the repeated skim, the meticulous separation of rootlet from charcoal fragment are appended and initialed. Reservoir tables, with their silent promise of an underlying cause, stretch out across pages, with rows of numbers unbroken by commentary. And yet, the clustered intervals remain. In their stubbornness, these plateaus do not single out a method or a caretaker. They appear wherever one looks, whenever a chronology is drawn from the Earth's carbon. The result is a quiet, persistent puzzle. Those who log the records do not intrude a voice, but their hesitation marks the page. What does not speak is noted by its presence. The clustering stands, unadorned and unexplained. Reports return again and again to the phenomenon, their language precise but withholding. The field records describe location, context, the act of sampling as if the explanation might be there in the soil beneath the hearth or the tangle of rootlets prized away from ancient fill. Each description lingers over the patterns observed. The same refrain surfacing beneath the floor of a chamber said to belong to a later phase. No cause is offered. There is only the notation of recurrence. The logs collect, the files thicken. Sometimes a tentative graph is sketched, the plateau circled, and a question mark placed in the margin. But more often, there is simply enumeration, the evidence left to state itself. The record is a kind of silence. If there is tension, it gathers not in debate but in the repetition of the unexplained. Are these plateaus the marks of ancient simultaneity? A moment when fires were lit and walls raised at once across distant habitations? Or do they speak to something older and shared, an inheritance of the method itself, a memory etched beneath more than one surface? The answer is not pressed. The plates and binders close with their unanswered refrain, offsets and patterns, numbers and slopes, clustering again and again, as though holding their breath at the threshold of disclosure. No explanatory mechanism is advanced in the field reports. No speculation permitted in the litany of logs. For those who read and reread these records, it is the sameness, the equal offset, the repetition that gives pause, the feeling, not of resolution but of return, again and again. The plateau stands against time's presumed progress. On shelves of stone and dust, in cabinets marked only by accession numbers, the charts and records persist. There is a sense that all rests as it was left. The binders quietly accumulating carbon-dated years, the annotations of careful hands, the correction tables aligned and realigned without verdict. Silence settles in the archive, and within it the plateaus endure, present in their clustered forms, their stilled numbers. The channels of time run neither clean nor continuous. Human activity, once so confidently sequenced, circles back into ambiguity under the locked, chastened rhythm of the plateau. Every record sampled, treated, measured, catalogued returns, in the end, to this impasse, this slender silence. And so the charts wait, undisturbed, repetition encased, as though holding their breath while the question gathers, suspended and intact. Whose calendar kept the same refrain? In the practiced quiet of the laboratory, certain principles are held to anchor the work. One, perhaps the most gently unchallenged, is the linking of preserved organic compounds with a known continuum of local flora and the subtle yet catalogable presences of microbial communities. It is an assumption that binds technique to expectation, ties what is unseen to an inventory prefigured by roots that once grew in nearby soils and by spores that circled these places long before they became sites of study. There is comfort in the idea that each compound, each oily signature exhaled by ancient matter, will be met by a cousin in the reference collections traced, named, folded quietly into the inherited inventory. There are moments when the core assumption seems to stand on already drifting sand. The sample drawer, opened with its habitual hush, yields a find that disturbs the threshold of previous knowing. Chemical analyses, arriving first in columns of notation, then in the exuberant lines of GCMS output, tell a patient, unrushed story. Resins and surface coatings, fossilized and dark, preserved in the glove of time, slide out from under sealing contexts and technological residues, not merely another demonstration of botanical presence, but something more resistant to identification, a disruption quietly embedded in the baseline. The method does not change. Fragments are handled, measured, weighed, and prepared. Sight and touch recede into the ritual of solvent and glass, routines of vapor carried through fine bored instruments. Yet the reports come back as deviations, terpenoid suites, their forms unspooling in the spectrum, fracture against the patterns catalogued in the regional plant records. The chemical shapes drift from the familiar to the other, each spike and plateau, cradled in the mass spectrum, resists easy mapping. Stable isotope ratios, similarly, refuse to align themselves with the expected signatures, drifting to values that sit outside the lines drawn by stored standards. The very bestiary of reference, with its vials and cards and slides, is silent before these combinations. The samples, resins, sticky and now dulled, sometimes a thumbnail's breadth, sometimes only a faint shadow pressed into the pocket of an artifact, are logged and registered. The drawer is closed with care, locking away the unexpected among the documented. Cold storage receives the archived matter, the labels written with practiced hand. Spectra join the growing digital memory in the database, mass after mass, curve after curve, artifacts of difference sealed alongside the more obedient ghosts of pine and oak and distant spore. There are no ordinary explanations written in the sources or the catalogue. Ethnobotanical parallels are searched with deliberate pace, sentences and sequences held against what the eye observes. But the lines do not touch. What should connect in presence, in pattern, in knowledge, remains separated by a margin that will not close. The technical stock inherits its own, but here intrusion and inheritance are unbalanced, evidenced only in the chemical shift, the silence of nothing to compare. Substance introduced, substance inherited, neither fully explaining nor merging with the other. The resin, once viscous and perhaps fragrant, loses its living colour in the darkness of storage. Its darkening is not merely a matter of exposure to time or air, but an accumulation of distance from context, from knowing. The matter that bound, that sealed, that held together what is now apart, alters not just in form, but in how it is permitted to be known. You return, again and again, to the drawer. The resin remains. A surface that was once sticky now hardens, blackening in the patience of decades. Its history resists narration. Its chemistry resists translation. Each observation yields the same impasse evidence, too particular to ignore and too foreign to absorb. Memory holds only the liminal, the edges of an uncertainty circled by repeated analysis. Again, you weigh it, document it, coax another profile from it, archive its resistance. The laboratory is silent, save for the clicking of cooled compressors, the hush of glove over glass. The drawers seal, the files close. Absence frames the evidence. What cannot be catalogued seeps slowly into the memory of those who record. The air is thick, not with answers, but with the persistence of the unknown. The resin's scent, if it had one, has long ago evaporated, displaced by the chilled, dry air of containment. Between assumption and evidence, the margin grows. What was once confidently believed is paused, unsettled by these trapped materials that refuse to participate in the archive's language. You are left, as all observers must be, with the evidence itself, its presence, its difference, its silence. In this, the material becomes both barrier and invitation, a seal refusing, a dark line separating the before from the after, the known from the encountered. If you open the drawer one more time, if you lean over the forms and spectra with patience, the question endures, quiet but insistent. What sticky material once bound those things? There is a comfort, almost a certainty, that lies within commonly held beliefs. The notion persists that abstract geometry, precise and disciplined, is the child of institutional corridors and regimented education, scribed only after the arrival of formal schooling or the rise of scribal specialists. This is the story most often told, sheltered by the pale light of tradition and curriculum. Geometry, according to this tradition, emerges only when lessons are given, when hands are trained, when knowledge is imparted in measured doses from master to novice. Each straight line, each proportion, each angle, the residue of instruction and didactic method. Such is the accepted frame. But stone is quiet, and stone is patient. In the half-light of abandoned walls and eroded surfaces, another kind of record waits. There are incised blocks and heavy tablets objects set apart from narrative, their surfaces scored by hands whose names are lost. Photographs capture these surfaces in situ. In the long, slow sweep of dust, geometric plans announce themselves, indifferent to the absence of students and the silence of vanished teachers. In these fragments, geometry is neither rare nor incomplete. The lines run parallel, sharp, uncompromised, and absolute. Across chiseled faces and broken perimeters, one sees right angles, edges defined by a deliberate intersection, always returning to their proper 90, unerring through centuries. There are girds, faint but not accidental, measurements still legible when the sun stretches low. Measured angles return repeated notations, carefully incised modules, marks that hold a discipline without visible context. The archaeological catalogue accepts these finds without embellishment, recording only presence, recurrence, consistency. Each entry is a quiet testament, a patient recording. Photographs show templates wooden, sometimes stone, resting in the places where they were last left. There are no captions describing lessons, no fragments of chalk, no stylus teacher correcting a trembling apprentice's hand. Only the diagrams, diagrammatic and abstract, persist silent testimony, untouched by formal pedagogy, unaccompanied by instruction or obvious demonstration. The evidence accumulates, stones catalogued, angles measured, templates displayed and returned to darkness. In some places, the inscriptions fall into dust, partially revealed and partially erased by the passing of time and climate. The proportions, executed with what cataloguers describe as tolerances within a hair, sometimes less defy an easy explanation. There is no narrative, not here, not scratched into the flatness of these surfaces. The lines declare nothing except themselves, free of accompanying figures, sans commentary, left apart from any story one wants to hear. Layers overlay these patterns, but none offer instruction. The diagrams stand alone, recorded in silence, revisited by silent hands. Absence is its own kind of presence. Now and then, a fragment of notation is found. A faint measurement, a duplicated module, marks repeated at intervals too regular to be spontaneous. No teacher's name carved, no student's plea for understanding, no echo of explanation. Only the abstraction itself, isolated and enduring longer than memory. Stone refuses to bear witness to schoolroom or scriptorium. The traces are empirical ghosts. For the observer, moving slowly along the ruins, catalogue sheet in hand, or camera angled, to avoid the afternoon's glare, nothing is ever entirely certain. The evidence is always a little ahead or a little behind, never yielding its full intent. The record remains careful and incomplete. Each measurement calmly logged, angle recorded, interval compared to the next, the shape mirrored, the whole described, but the why lingers outside the evidence. Sometimes, the sweep of a grid continues outside the margins of the stone. Sometimes, proportional notations lose themselves at a fracture, the regularity breaking beneath a missing piece. Every repetition beckons, but the lines remain silent, purely technical, without narrative or announcement. They seem to have been meant, but not signified. The researcher holds the evidence lightly, turns it over in shadow and in light, knowing the record is neither complete nor empty, just persistent. There is tension in the quiet, somewhere between spontaneous craft and the invisible current of transmitted knowledge. The lines float absolute, unexplainable, indifferent. The field ledger grows, but never clarifies. The geometric forms have no heirs in the record, no learned hands to pair with them in text or story. Instead, geometry, drawn with unrelenting precision, lingering before institutional memory or method, will not yield its origin. Dust accumulates gently. Stones shelter their abstractions beneath darkness and silence. The diagrams rest, neither erased nor explained, lodged in the threshold between invention and repetition. They wait, unspoken, for a witness who arrives too late, for a scribe who writes without knowing. Who drew those precise lines? One is told to trust the sequences. Domestication follows in orderly procession, mapped in ink and shaded in the gradation of ages past. Each region joined to its rightful phase, a known pattern under carefully archived scrutiny. The established line holds wild here, domestic there. A silent border patrolled by expected chronology. The pattern is a comfort, a structure shaped by decades of curated excavation reports and comparative morphometrics. A slow accretion of data, arranged in tables and stratigraphic charts. The canonical timeline settles over the finds, like dust. Yet beneath this assurance, something fragile presses at the edges. In the indistinct margins, peripheral sites, scraps of habitation, where the great movements of history seem to pass gently by, the pattern does not always hold. Faunal reports are submitted with the usual reserve, yet the catalogue grows heavier with anomalies. The first hints lie within the bones themselves. Size reduced beyond wild expectations, traces of pathologies familiar to those who have seen prolonged confinement, subtle signs, microstriations, joints worn in the manner of animals held and handled, herd profiles emerge, demographic distributions unlikely in untamed populations, an odd concentration of young males, a disproportionate mortality curve. These are not the marks that wildness leaves behind. They are quiet fingerprints of something else, another relationship lying between human and beast. One not marked directly by walls or fences, but by form, by absence, by what is left within the body itself. The scene is silent. One is not present for the cutting, the tending, the gathering at dusk. There is only the aftermath bones layered in the deep substrate, surviving between lenses of habitation, debris, and ash. Zooarchaeological catalogues offer their specifics, bone metrics, ratios measured by calipers on damp mornings in cluttered labs, tables crowded with digits and uncertain margins of error. The abrasions and cut marks are rendered in notations, each specimen accessioned, labelled, assigned a record number. Demographic profiles are reconstructed via stable isotope analysis, revealing parallel lines of life history. Who grazed, who was kept, who was dispatched young, who grew older under a human shadow. There are no pens or byres found above. The overlying stratum holds no remnants of corrals, no stone fodder bins, no architectural relics supporting certainty. The evidence is the absence as much as the presence. Animals altered, yet no enclosure left behind. Inside archival storage, trays hold what the ground would otherwise swallow. Long bones, vertebrae, fragments too small for the untrained eye to name. Each tag speaks for a silence, context, depth, layer, square. A narrative that unfolds without voice. A story composed in increments of missing flesh and vanished routine. The tension builds not in spectacle, but in accumulation data points, mounting quietly, pressing against the edge of expectation. Morphological change is not a proclamation, it is an erosion, a slipping threshold at which wildness is gently, almost imperceptibly, replaced. The catalogue becomes a record of hesitation. Recorders describe, compare, assign probable origin, and just as often pause, deferred by the ambiguity that lingers between the lines. In the dim corners of the archive, memory and time run together. The reports do not answer, they simply describe, row after row, what is seen and what is not. The bones keep their own counsel. No image of capture, no whispered intent, reaches across the centuries. The absence of structures leaves intent clouded, process occluded, a relationship only traced through changes, worn into bone by years of quiet proximity. The question flickers, then withdraws. One stands before trays, documents, a dozen reconstructed profiles, and listens. The room is hushed. Evidence alone is offered, held out in measured increments, inviting but not yielding. Again and again, the coded repetition asserts itself. Here, animals altered. Here, no enclosures. Here, time's layers sealing the question in muted earth. The official sequence still stands, but now with a tremor, a gentle but insistent pressure from data that does not belong, from modifications that precede the accepted horizon. The catalogued remains refuse easy resolution, and yet the pressure of their differences refuses to be dismissed. The accumulated silence becomes almost tangible, more firmness in what is not found than in what is. Against the calm tide of dust and datum, one is left to wonder. Trays rest, bones endure. The measured quiet sustains itself from decade to decade. awaiting language that does not arrive. What was the nature of that earliest tending, whose traces have outlasted every word but left none behind? It is taken as given that no word arises unaided. Language accompanies the material world as if caught in the slipstream of things newly invented, borrowed, or shaped. The standard line carried forward in texts, repeated in lecture halls, whispered across workroom tables runs like this. Technical vocabulary, the names for tools, for measurements, for substances and weights, crystallizes alongside the things themselves. Where there is innovation in stone or bronze or reed, some ripple spreads into the mouths and hands of those who use them. Each term presumed to be traceable, each bit of language presumed to migrate forward, changing, merging, but never truly ending. Yet, among the ruins, dust-shrouded, heavy with absence, there are carved marks that do not align. There are fragments where the stone does not simply echo lineage, but mutters something singular, self-contained. Across the stretch of time and the breadth of the sites, labels brief and undeciphered appear again and again. They cling to surfaces where once an instrument rested, or along the edge of a block that once joined another. You notice these words, or word-like forms, repeating with uncanny regularity. And yet there is no clear ancestry. They recur, detached from family, unmoored from later tongues. Material objects outlast their makers. Sometimes so too do the earliest names, surviving on stone when memory itself is lost. In the stillness of the hall, under the low buzz of fluorescent lamps, researchers sit before these objects, tracing lines cut into once soft surfaces. Hands brush gently along the incisions. In margins of ledgers and notebooks, transcriptions accumulate first as careful sketches, then as attempts at transliteration, later as strings of phonetic shapes bearing uncertain value. The granularity of the record is stark. Weighty slabs bear only a single term, sometimes no more than a cluster of unfamiliar symbols. Adjoining these are the practical diagrams, a square, a wedge, a simple plumb, names for things, things themselves, a concordance of matter and sound that gestures toward understanding and simultaneously withholds it. Each short inscription is technical, not commemorative. No grand genealogies are carved. There are no appeals to kings, no prayers to invisible gods, no boasts of victory or warning. Just terms, if they are terms deliberately chosen, limited in scope, economical in form. Often the sign is repeated identically across distant sites, latitude and epoch separating them. But a commonality persists. Epigraphic records note the frequency, underline the repeated association of mark to object, commit phonetic approximations to the ledgers. The work is cautious. The ledgers accumulate uncertainty as much as knowledge. Every entry records what stands before the observer, nothing more. Silence fills the space between the lines. It is not loud, and yet it presses at the edges of interpretation. Every attempt to correlate a sign with a later tongue sifts through 1,000 possibilities. Each offset, each partial. The words should, they be words resist translation. They remain isolated in the files, silent stones lying among the more legible fragments of the past. The nothingness that surrounds their meanings is palpable. Even the most persistent record keeper, hunched in a distant library or digging beneath shadecloth at noon, cannot move past them. Row after row of catalogue entries, some struck through, many simply left blank, language and ignorance interleaved. The process cycles. Over the years, new hands take up the ledgers. Old rubbings grow brittle. Digital scans replace charcoal, but the inscriptions themselves remain unchanged. Label, tool, measurement, substance. The same rootless words surface, resisting absorption, defying inheritance. They stand as small anomalies, reminders of the framework that usually holds inherited lexicon, stable transmission, gradual change, now quietly unsettled. Even as one generation of epigraphers retires, another moves in, hesitates, repeats the process, records the same uncertainty. Nothing about the evidence resolves. Instead, it keeps returning. In the afterimage, left by night work, a camp light illuminating the uneven surface of a carved block, the observer runs a finger across the groove. The stone is cold. The inscription, colder. The name for the thing, left without context or kin, endures. Around it, language advances and retreats. But here, in the quiet hush of the archive, an untethered word waits, unclaimed by time or ancestry. Memory falters, and the stones keep their secrets. Still, the question redoubles, sustained by every failure to translate, every missing root, every silent file and blank field. It is an old and persistent assumption. The electrical belongs to the age of wires and circuits, to the realm of dynamos and batteries, far from the ancient clay and dust. In distant epochs, or so the tendency holds, there were no currents. No charge leapt between surfaces. No invisible energies traced their secret courses through matter. The material record is the story, so it is said, of more basic needs: storage, ritual, utility. The prosaic routines of life, carefully encased in earth and stone. That which is electrical emerges only as a symptom of the modern, an intruder in older rooms. There is comfort in such divisions. The age of ceramics is the age before the spark. Yet, among the methodical places where fragments are stored, the evidence resists this comfort. Conservation inventories list objects with a hesitant exactness. Ceramic vessels, simple in outward form, now bear layers of residue unaccounted for by ordinary use. The inventories those lifeless ledgers remark, with cool consistency, on conductive traces bonded intimately to the inner surfaces, on iridescent films thin as breath, on shadows of copper, where there should be only the memory of grain or oil or incense. The records note that these films are not random, nor do they match the debris left by accidental fire or storage. Thin sheets of metal copper, most often, but sometimes an alloy cling as if deliberately deposited. There is no context of smelting, no hearths nearby, no slag or crucibles, merely clay and the cryptic residues of something else. It is always in the details that disruption begins. Inhabitants of decades past, curators, conservators, unnamed hands with gloves logged these ceramics, photograph by measured photograph. Their roles are silent, but their absence is inscribed on every card, every negative filed away. Objects are described as found in domestic corners or at the edges of shrines. Instead, these vessels emerge quietly in household earth. Among fragments of vessels for water, oil, grain, sometimes they are slipped into the matrices of ritual, the borderlands of use and belief. Never do the notes speak of industry, only utility, or devotion, or the mundane persistence of storage. The analytical records speak softly, in the sparse idiom of microscopy. Copper, detected in filaments that curve and gather in delicate arcs. Elsewhere, the same element is pressed into coils or folded plates, adhering silently to the dead white body of fired clay. These structures resist easy explanation. There are patterns suggestive of order, as though residue was not simply spilled but guided. Yet the reports, in their caution, state what is seen: deposits, thickness, orientation. The findings are measured and weighed, not interpreted. Across the margins of old paper, there is no leap into conjecture. There is only what can be written down. Over time, the layer of description grows. The catalogue numbers accumulate. The photographs flatten 3 dimensions into the shallow depth of black and white. Each object finds its way to a shelf, barcoded or quietly tagged, prepared for the indifference of years. In the cooled hush of storage, the ceramics line up in imperfect ranks, each one preserving its surfaces. They do not invite answers. There is no inscription to guide the hand, no carved sign to unravel purpose, no echo of the language that might explain. The possibility of technology remains unnamed by those who found them. Their reporters do not tell stories. They record presence, residue, material, context. The silence is almost total. Nevertheless, As you look, the evidence resists disappearance. What purpose, really, did these structures serve? The presence of copper does not clarify. The absence of known functions only deepens the pause. There is a tension here, between the assumed and the observed. A silent reframing that does not, perhaps cannot, announce itself. The temptation is always to reach for a category, to offer a name, to decide vessel, lamp, relic, or conduit. But the records remain suspension, each entry a subtle refusal. There is no contemporary text to clarify. No ancient observer announces, in stone or ink, that a current once ran here. Silence is the aura that surrounds. Time compiles its own inventory. Years pass quietly in the museum, in the storeroom, in the cellars of collections that line institutional corridors. The ceramics persist, accumulating dust, undergoing the cool stasis of things left unhandled. Their surfaces endure, unchanged, or slowly altered by the climate of darkness and rest. Context recedes, evidence endures. The tension does not resolve. Within these remains lies a testimony that refuses final form, a residue measured yet unexplained. If the categories are insufficient, if the words do not fit the thing, the distance between the observer and the object only grows. There are only these preserved vessels, quietly separate from the certainty of function. There are only the records, the restrained language of inventories, the passive voice of microscopy. Description accumulates, but the core persists. Ceramic, copper, film, coil, residue, evidence, and the unspoken pause. The ceramics cool on their shelves. In the hush, in layers of description and silence, they wait. What currents, if any, once passed through them? There is an assumption, now so deeply worn as to pass unnoticed, that navigational systems, those frameworks for long-distance orientation, seeded into the memory of oceans, emerge where maritime societies grow most complex. The story settles over charts and currents. As skill developed, so too did the subtle ordering of the coasts, the careful transmission of direction, the inheritance of bearings tangible and abstract alike. This is the framework entrusted in scholarship, layered atop each new core, each faded journal page, each fleeting line in the silt. On the rack edge of ancient shorelines, a different kind of evidence endures. Where water once pressed against land and now presses still, surveyors find the same betrayal of assumption. Regular stones, too deliberate to be random, quieted by silt, linger at thresholds submerged by time. Along stretches of coast now claimed by the rhythmic hush of waves, these markers stand silent, arranged, cut by grooves at intervals that, once measured, resist the logic of chance. They do not shout, but mark, with a restraint that amplifies their persistence. In the tidal gloom, alignment emerges, traced to bearings that still echo the contours of distant points, familiar on modern instruments, imprinted upon reconstructions of coastlines as they once were. Instead, the observer stands notes in hand, survey rod poised recording distances, angles, elevations, all against the indifferent drift of the present sea. To catalogue the stones is to accept a kind of silence. Each groove yields a number. Each position calls for mapping onto the latticework of reconstructed shorelines. Yet the process remains taut, suspended between what persists and what is lost to submersion, between the clarity of measurement and the opacity of meaning. Sediment cores are driven, layer by layer, extracting pale memory from beneath present currents. These cores are compared relentlessly with the points where the stones now rest. There are alignments to catalogue, intervals to check, boundaries of high tide and low tide to negotiate. Still, the strata above the markers, those terrestrial layers once dry, bear nothing of ports or settlements, no scattered detritus of habitation, no durable sign of anchorage. Only after, in much later sediment, do traces of coastal life reappear. The earlier stones remain isolated, intentional, but contextless, the signal outstripping the noise. There is a hardness to the stones themselves. Half swallowed by sand, they resist easy chronology. Carbon cannot number them, pottery does not frame them, and so their presence must be acknowledged in increments, by shadow and outline, by what sits above and below, by the mute witness of the sea. The stones wait under thinning light, holding the implication of use without the continuity of record. The absence of contemporary port, of human footprint, shares authority with what survives. Each measured datum, each confirmation of alignment, contributes not reassurance but a quiet unease, widening the rift between what is supposed and what endures. Plane table sketches and digital scans join with the sequence of logged positions, translated against both sea-level transgressions and the models that grind old terrain into probability. The archival observer is taught patience by the evidence. For each stone, there is only its presence, its carved groove, its inclination. Consensus is not the gift these markers offer. Rather, they insist on attention, asking for the repetition of measurement, the return to sight as sea and season allow, the gradual assembly of a pattern both stubborn and partial. The stones themselves do not move, but the context shifts. Once elevated above storm surge, they know only the salt-wetted hush, the slippage of sand above their bases, the corrosion of time. They bear no inscription, no claimed ownership, only an orientation to vanished horizons. Memory is layered this way, part object, part setting, part the long forgetting of shoreline. Silence edges in at each revisit. The stones, half immersed, surrender nothing to explanation. There are no inscriptions, no ruins, no records of those who set them. The gap yawns, quietly, between intention and survival, between markers that sought to mean and an inheritance that cannot, finally, recover meaning in full. Instead, the survey is redoubled not for assurance but for persistence, to affirm that the stones are there, are lined, are real, even as interpretation recedes. With no settlements embedded nearby, the tension between these ordered markers and the later, sprawling reach of coastal habitation becomes the story that remains. With light diffused against a horizon that dissolves into sea, the stones settle into their inheritance. The observer retreats, measurements inscribed in field books, maps annotated, reports left carefully incomplete. Silence persists here, not as absence, but as the weight of what cannot be spoken. Time folds and refolds around these beacons, their purpose suggested, withdrawn, suggested again. The stones look outward, indifferent to questions, steady as the current, abraded by salt but unimpressed by the search for closure. It begins with a belief, the quiet, almost reflexive acceptance that thick bands of ash found in the Earth's sediment belong to singular origins. A disturbance neatly folded into the register of what has already been written. The familiar, the catalogued, the comfortably known. Each layer of fine grey powder, each pale seam in loam or clay, is quietly assigned to some established cause. The mountain's breath, the valley's burn, a story already told. To assume is to build a scaffold on sediment, trusting the layers will hold. Under this assumption, the world becomes a palimpsest of catastrophes, each one discrete, already mapped by the chronicle, already set down by earlier hands. But sediment has its own insistence, a way of speaking in layers where words cannot follow. Time does not announce its disturbances. The evidence arrives in silence, a pollen shift, abrupt, measured in the smallest spores suspended within the ash. Not one basin but several, not one episode, but the echo of simultaneity, the same chemical signature carried by the wind, brushed into the soil, settled upon quiet water. The palynologist reads the story in dust. Across sediment cores, synchrony, the sharp, incontrovertible realignment of pollen taxa and glass-shard tephra, written together, cross-hatched in the geometry of the core. Laboratory sheets hold these observations in neat script. Archivally safe form, the measured distance between then and now. There is a discipline, almost reverence, in how the evidence is transcribed. Stratigraphic boundaries rendered by the millimeter. Tephra, chemistry detailed in rows of elemental ratios, graphite pencil trailing behind each observation. None of the core samples speak aloud, but the archive has memory. Here, the expectation of the singular gives way to the accumulation of the synchronous, echoing a moment when the ordinary line between past and present was breached. There is no explanation pinned in the margins, only notations of depth, color, texture, a periodic density of ash where pollen abruptly shifts. There is a kind of symmetry in the evidence, a mirroring between disparate basins, a repeatable anomaly. Now, instead of a lone event, the data suggests simultaneity, dispersal, coordination without cause. Here, the calm hands of the technician take samples, weigh, document, preserve, always distilling tangible into abstract, the quiet alchemy of observation. Above the ash, the record shifts. Settlements left behind. Human occupation mapped in charcoal flecks and the patterned post holes of vanished beams suddenly arresting. Architectural remnants remain at rest on the stratigraphic profile. Low stone, unfired brick, a hint of wall. Each structure hovers over the line of ash as if poised, waiting, unresolved. The habitations above are recorded as vacated, distinguished by their silence, few signs of transition, fewer deposits of abandonment. No slow taper, no gradual dissolution of hearth and home. Instead, cessation, absence. The built world, rows of rooms, courtyards, tool marks still visible in the stone, remains perched on the edge of significance, unoccupied, stilled in the place where ash and silence meet. Field sheets accumulate. Location, elevation, orientation, composition. The void between occupation levels is marked by absence, a sharp border, less between age than intent. The presence of so little material, so few objects misplaced or broken in the act of leaving, becomes another form of testimony. What remains says as much as what is lost. In this space, the archive is not only measured but felt, a ledger of what could not be carried away. The language of sediment becomes implacable, detailing a kind of punctuation in the archaeological sentence. The trace of routine, abruptly cancelled, the endogenous pause in the beating heart of habitation. Tephra and pollen catalogues are brought together, compared. In the laboratory's muted light, samples are numbered, slides prepared, with each relation marked and checked against the expectations. Chemistry aligns, the same spectrum of silicates, the same ratios, echoing from basin to basin, tessellated across the map. Paper records accumulate in soft folders, the entire process resembling a muted choreography, taking, labeling, measuring, cataloguing, returning. There is no rush, only the curiosity of meticulous attention. Statistics do not stir emotion, yet the pattern is restless, serial, consistent, gently insistent. The lab holds the memory more securely than words, each core sample held in cool darkness, residue of urgency now stilled by time. Above these trace elements, the visible world is marked by absence. Walk the sites, stone stacked in unfinished walls, the trace of a hearth beneath a drift of ash. Empty houses roofless to the sky. There is no evidence of resistance, no sign of a gradual infiltration by another people. Maps note the missing years. Architectural plans trace the empty rectangles where life once moved. And yet, the only interpreter is the stratum itself. What lies below, what lies within, what still lingers. There is no comfort in the record, only the implication of fracture and silence. No explanation is offered, none is assumed. The evidence anchors its own quiet gravity, an unresolved pause in the ongoing accumulation of ordinary life. What forced that leaving? Assumption holds like an old refrain, that standardized weights emerge only where markets settle within the boundaries of established polities, that order precedes the counters by which value is reckoned. This is the line drawn in dust, and retold first the city, then the scale, first the contract, then the balance. Yet in the record, something endures in quiet contradiction. It is neither proclamation nor open rebellion. Instead, it is the slow persistence of stone weights appearing in the virgin stratigraphies of places with no sign of urban grid or formal exchange, both old and scattered, refusing alignment with the official histories that order demands. Evidence recurs more insistently, the longer one lingers over the catalogues. Stone objects plain, regular, drilled once through the centre or at the edge, sit in temple shadows, at scattered outposts, in homes that never gather into towns. Each weight's form is dignified by its restraint. A flattened sphere, an oblong slip, the shadows of dull edges wearing at the memory of their own purpose. Everywhere, the drilled suspension points mark interruption, a hole through which cord once passed, now vacant as the air that gathers in a sealed drawer. Hands centuries later, or perhaps yesterday, lift each weight from dust and isolation, recording what can be measured. The mass, steady under metal scale. The length, compressed between hesitant calipers. The catalogue entry, quietly stubborn. Masses are tallied, numbers inscribed, and all are entered in registers, one after another, with no embellishment, as if the discipline of record-keeping can itself displace the silence of origins. There are no scribal notes detailing exchanges, no seals marking transaction, no echo of haggling voices or the whisper of commerce formalized. Absence, in this context, weighs more than stone. Provenance notes offer only what sight and layer can surrender. No hand survives to testify why a drawer now holds what was once slung from a string. When the evidence is set side by side, weight after weight, catalogue after catalogue, patterns begin to assert themselves. Almost apologetically, the measured masses reveal their ratios, repeating quietly in decimals and halves, halves of halves, each with intolerances so precise that coincidence falters. Across distances once unbreached, forms repeat in their balance, harmony preserved across unseen divisions, at times that history has not yet portioned into towns and states. Here is equilibrium before the boundaries that would later define it. Here is repetition without directive. To witness this evidence is to stand at the threshold of possible meaning, unwilling to step beyond what stone and silence allow. One may stack the weights, holding their steady increase, their rhythmic decrease, or run a finger over the cold line of a suspension hole that once was threaded functions paused when hands let go. One may open yet another drawer, always the same ritual. Removal, inspection, measurement, a note in pencil, drawer shut again. Light falls through dust into the archive, and nothing in the room suggests the clamour of the market. Are these weights instruments of a system, or only tokens of isolated attempts at order? Records offer no more than mass and form. Suspended in the absence of accounting, they persist in describing a system whose contours can be weighed but not traced. The drawers where they rest are silent, yielding provenance but not intention. The registers, filled with numbers and ratios, do not speak. The room is quiet, now as then, marked more by what cannot be known than by the accumulation of data. Daylight shifts across labels, peeling at the edges. One observes, enters figures, finds the ratios constant and the silence deeper for it. Implied, networks flicker at the edge of evidence, too faint to declare, too regular to dismiss. The disciplined mass of each stone shames speculation, but cannot still the question of how value found its calibration before the narrative of order overtook the stones themselves. No one comes to claim these weights now. They persist, balanced as always, in darkness and drawers, their function suspended, memory reduced to record, and form awaiting a future inquiry that might resolve what the present can only witness. Evidence, in its mute endurance, is neither allegation nor apology. The facts are placed in their order, leaving absence as their residue, a gap no accounting note will close. And so there remains, at the edge of light, in that interval between possession and oblivion, this unresolved suspension. Who first balanced value thus? There is an enduring assumption, carried quietly but firmly through generations of those who observe and preserve, that the way graves are aligned is not accidental. The thought is simple, almost an axiom. Tomb orientations must correspond to the larger cosmology of the people who set them into place. Each alignment, each axis, is believed to echo something of the sky, the world above, an order adopted from the cosmos and pressed gently but persistently into the soil. It is a belief repeated wordlessly every time one stands by an ordered row. Each headstone or marker offering its silent confirmation, each furrow of earth a line in some forgotten diagram. What the living inherit, they replicate with reverence or perhaps habit, shaping remembrance into geometry. Yet, layered beneath this expectation, another pattern surfaces. The plans of the cemetery tell of a different sort of consistency, one measured, calculated, and quietly resistant to the ordinary drift of time. The evidence emerges in the records. Cemetery surveys, captured on thick, yellowed paper, record the orientations of each grave. Coordinates, bearings, precise azimuths marked out with a surveyor's careful hand. Against the backdrop of centuries, the lines remain true. The oldest burials, the first set down in the sequence, present the same orientation as those interred generations later. There is no rotation, no drift, just a continuous echo of alignment, unbroken and meticulous. Each burial, noted in the record, reflects the same facing. Details are collected with an archivist's devotion. Osteological inventories confirm the position of the bodies, preserved as if to offer proof to unseen auditors. Across brittle ledgers and updated digital records, the repetitions hold. There is no suggestion of change, no generation that turned, no decade that faltered. The absence becomes its own kind of presence, a silence that resists interpretation and insists on being acknowledged. The physical evidence compounds the mystery. Plan drawings, measured with the rigidity of a trained surveyor's discipline, reveal that each grave's orientation matches a celestial pole. Not the pole that reigns above the living at the time the graves were dug, but a pole calculated for antiquity, predating the establishment of the cemetery by centuries. It is a pole that exists now only as a mathematical abstraction, a memory preserved in tables and reconstructed from the paths of stars already shifted. The graves, nonetheless, retain their facing, each one relating to something that has already moved on, a sky no longer inhabited by its reference point. No inscription explains this. No local tradition bothers to remember it. Comparison invites a sharper focus. Here, the uniformity resists context. Neighboring cemeteries, only a short distance away, do not keep such discipline. Their orientations wander, shift with the slope of the land, respond to practicalities or fashions or gently held beliefs. In those places, the line between order and accident blurs, and the story is one of gradual change and forgotten intention. But here, at this site, the pattern refuses to dissolve, fixed as a needle held fast by magnetism unseen. Within the community that continues to visit, to memorialize, to record not one living witness, offers explanation or memory. The chosen direction, the fixed orientation, persists without reasoned justification or inherited story. There are no rituals that speak its meaning. If the knowledge once existed, it has receded entirely. If it was meant to be evident, its context has grown thin, almost threadbare. The current inheritors accept the grave lines as given, occasionally remarking on their neatness, but offering nothing beyond the observation itself. Silence presides over intent. And so, tension coils quietly between the evidence and the absence, between the observable regularity and the entirely unrecorded thought that first called for it. The graves are not neutral arrangements. They are persistent, deliberate, and unyielding. Each one is both a relic and a question, a signal set into the earth that no longer has its sender. The line they preserve pierces darkness and time, as if anchoring memory to coordinates both known and forgotten. They register the sameness with the patience of those who know the value of intervals, yet the measured alignment remains its own mute resistance to explanation. In summer stilled by dust, in frost where outlines blur, the orientations are checked and rechecked, unchanged. Stone keeps its bearing through erosion. Shadows repeat the line as the sun wheels overhead. Bones beneath the soil echo a direction that no living pulse can name. It is not the presence of logic that lingers, but its inheritance devoid of witness, its persisting form shorn of claim. The community entrusted with these graves does not direct nor deviate. They maintain, they do not remember. In the dark soil, the aligned dead remain where they were set, each facing a void mapped out by astronomical calculation, pointed but unilluminated by living knowledge. The question that surfaces and refuses to be closed hovers over every chart, every field note, every silent morning the Rosa walked. Whose sky dictated that line? It was once assumed quietly, with the weight of consensus, almost unconsciously, that local hydrochemical shifts were measured and slow, a gentle arcing curve linked reliably to the patient breath of climate, as if water itself could only move at the gradual pace prescribed by the sky and the seasons. Each change, salinity, clarity, mineral accumulation, was to follow the established cadence, shaped by rains that could be charted, winds that could be predicted, sun that could be remembered. This rhythm, once accepted, became invisible. Only the records, fragile and silently accumulating, might know otherwise. Yet there is the core. Cylindrical, cold, notched and numbered, laid horizontal in a lab's refrigerated gloom. Remnants of historical lakebed, now pared down into increments of sediment. Millimetre pressed against millimetre, each a feathered ledger of chemistry under layers of lost summers, lost floods, lost droughts. Silence clings to the material, but an abruptness is present, restless, resisting the calm. There, a narrow band of pale density interrupts darker mud. A vein of salts hardens, glittering faintly when angled to lab light. What should have been gradual, what centuries of climatic doctrine would expect as a slow climb here, declares itself as a spike. Not a criminal breaking in, but rather evidence, preserved indifferently, that a threshold was crossed. Conductivity proxies, inked into logbooks, are sudden. Numbers leap, rather than stroll, across the page. Isotopic series, charted line after line in restrained script, shift from one ratio to another, not across eons, but as if in a season's turn. Microfaunal remains, sifted carefully from among the mineral grains, vanish or surge. Memory, once supposed to lie smooth, is instead uneven, chiseled with discontinuity. Archival voices hover in excavation notes as well. Collapse layers in unroofed architecture, dusted out from under centuries of wind and indifference, align gently, almost coincidentally, with the timing in the cause. Earth that was once shaped and used is now scattered, slumped, its composition subtly altered. Abandonment horizons are sketched in field maps, measured by fingers pressed to cool stratified ground. Above this, the detritus of presence. Below, the signature of absence. There is no narrative, only alignment, timings that whisper in unity but do not say why. Ancient silt, sand, evaporite, all boxed and numbered, sometimes with nothing but the date, the latitude, a note about the drill depth, ordered and ensconced under refrigeration hum. Their laminae remain composed, unprotesting. If asked, they would recall only seasonal repetition. But the chemistry remains inscribed within, a record of water departing, or perhaps intruding, not with warning but with haste. Patterns expected from regional climate reconstructions, the slow progression of drought, the gently rising evaporation, fail to appear at these key intervals. There is a fingerprint of sudden imbalance, of water remade under circumstances now lost to statistical models. The laminae, exfoliated one upon the other in silent compression, wait. In those refrigerated drawers, researchers open each core with the ritual of unsealing, gazing at the sequence with the restraint of record keepers. Hands are gloved, breath is shallow, movements measured to avoid the accidental. Salinity, that most invisible of forces, is measured in microvolts, in ratios, in the brittle conformation of extinct microfauna. The work is procedural, the disruptions unmistakable. A line in the data becomes a pause by the observer. A spike becomes a silence in the room. The tension does not resolve. Instead, it accumulates. There are field logs, pages handwritten or typed, sheets marked with small, blockish notations of depth and color, notes on mineralogy. There are captions under out-of-focus photographs, a scattering of crossed-out numbers, layers described in centimeters, color described as grayish, olive. Sometimes a stray comment. Change begins here. Rarely, a question mark. More often, only space between entries. There is an insistence on the ordinary catalogue, refrigerate, label, but the records persist in their disquiet. Climatic models, constructed later and at a distance, suggest a steady world outside, yet the cores, pressed to facts, resist that suggestion. Nothing is resolved in their presence. Each line of evidence builds not to certainty, but to a vista of absence. No records of triggering drought or violent precipitation accompany these particular salts, these sharp-edged changes. The collapse of structure, of settlement, is thus positioned on a precipice of implication, that core chemistry may precede abandonment, that environment may act, not answer. This is left hanging, unvoiced in the data yet apparent to eyes accustomed to sequences, to the weight of non-coincidence. The air is cooled, the sound hushed, the interval between refrigeration cycles a subtle clock. No conclusion emerges, only the insistent layering of anomaly atop anomaly, stilled into artifact, preserved in time's lucid refrigeration. The laminae remain, season upon season fused into story, hinting at a loss as much environmental as human, as much chemical as lived. Memory is made particulate, preserved, exhausted. It is a comfortable doctrine, difficult to unsettle, that the exchange of form and meaning travels along the vectors of contact, one group meeting another beneath the weight of proximity, intentions declared or unspoken, aesthetic fragments passing like silent ambassadors between worlds. The belief endures that iconography spreads outward through tangible threads of encounter, guided by the deliberate hand of adoption, the subtle eye of imitation. Such is the accepted scaffold. Motifs cross boundaries, motifs borrow from neighbors, motifs are signals of cultural touch, and yet, among the records, the artifact logs, and the weathered surfaces, the clarity of such lines fades. There is a glyph, neither singular nor anomalous in its recurrence, yet its persistent appearance resists this logic of exchange. The pattern is composite, unmistakable once noticed. Its curvature beneath the etched edge holds firm across distance, repetition both exacting and restrained, each mark seemingly guided not by improvisation or local adaptation, but by an adherence to proportions that travels invisibly, undiminished by space. The same motif, pressed into stone blocks, laid into the shadow of ceremonial masonry, and again on the small utility of objects designed for hand or glance, a capstone, a lintel, a worn fragment of worked bone, a bead in sediment. Such pieces emerge from contexts without ostensible commerce, without the scaffolding of exchange. The fieldwork details its presence in registers of description, the careful notation of location, dimension, state of abrasion. Site after site, its form repeats, ratios recorded, the eye lingering over the measured angles of its linear geometry, a geometry that neither slips toward the idiosyncratic nor veers into the exuberant. That underlying consistency, the discipline of its scale, persists even where stone has slipped away under centuries of rain or sun. There is the silence of what is not found. No explanatory mark bordering these glyphs, no lines of script that tie symbol to word, or offer sheltering explanation. Not a name, not a stated function, not a ritual. The motif stands alone. It is entered dutifully in symbol catalogues, cross-referenced by similarity and position, its likeness rendered in the quiet ink of field sketches, its sequence preserved in inventory. Again and again, the registrars note the precision, a proportional hold that does not degrade, as if held in collective memory or an inscription deeper than language. The motif crosses the boundaries of context, as if those boundaries were porous, there in the structural, embedded at threshold or eave, there among tokens turning up in administrative scatters, there woven into the dust of domestic refuse. Its transitions do not alter its structure. The geometry endures, closed upon itself. Within these layers, The ordinary assumptions of contact and transmission start to thin. There is no direct line from trader to recipient, no indication of a transactional hand, no context that assigns origin or asserts departure. The repetition appears almost anonymous, stripped of interpersonal intention. Still, it persists not as a facsimile, not as an echo, but as itself. In the open air, these glyphs endure the dissolution of seasons. Time, when read across their surfaces, is an erosion, edges blurred, grooves smoothed, an ambiguity advancing on precision. Rain seeps, frost splits, light falters. The remnants remain discernible, sometimes only as hauntings on stone, traces visible for the observer willing to pause. Some are exposed, some buried beneath later strata, each revealing itself according to the patient labour of excavation. In every instance, the observer is left suspended between what is present and what must be inferred. The archives amass sketches, measurements, site diagrams, inventories of the recurring symbol. But even the most meticulous ledger cannot clarify necessity or origin. Each attempt at context finds itself circling a persistent lack. The epigraphic silence is not simply absence, but a kind of noise, a negative space asserting itself against the satisfaction of analysis. It is in this lack, the absence of direct inscription, that uncertainty anchors itself. Motif, surface, measurement, recurrence, all that is left is evidence without illumination. The glyph's own endurance is the only testament. Those who documented it, the surveyor with tape and caliper, the archivist with catalogue page and ink, are not permitted to inhabit knowledge, only to record. The motif careens backward into silence, always repeating, never explaining. What remains are the edges of objects, the slow forgetting of meaning. In the dust, in the perpetual exposure to wind and rain, the glyph recedes from certainty. What did that sign mean to its first viewers? You arrived in the stillness we began with. Here, evidence has been the patient interlocutor. Inscriptions, cuts, cores, residues, records of hands that preceded the names we use. The shift now is from questions of origin to the manner of holding. You look at ruins and inherited arrangements, and must decide what stewardship means when caretaking what is older than memory. If you remain, reflect, and keep a light. If you would continue this quiet work, like and subscribe as if you were adding a ledger entry. What will you inherit?